I have a question for you. How do I decide if it's right to use a certain kind of technology? Or put another way, how do I decide what the ethics are of tools? Let's think about it in a concrete way. So I got my hammer here. Is this neutral? Is it depend on the use, or is there any ethics embedded in this? Is this good or bad? Can it be good or bad, or is it just a tool, just something I use for a specific purpose? If you thought, no, clearly that's neutral, it just depends on how you use it, then you're thinking about tools in a sense of neutrality. So that way would say, well, you can use it for a good thing, you can build things with it, or use it for a bad thing, you could hurt someone with it. And that says it's not in the abuse, but the use of the tool that we need to think about its ethics. But I can think about that tool in a different way. Let's bring back that hammer. So I can think about this in the sense of, what does it enable me to do? Is it a tool that restricts what I can do? Do I need a special license or training to use this hammer? Do I need to use it only a specific way? Or does it enable me to be creative? Does it enable me to build things for others? Does it enable me to improve my relationships with others as maybe I build a safe place for them to stay? That's another way to look at tools, where not necessarily saying that they're neutral and depends on how I use it. There can also be a way to say, if are there values already embedded in the design of the tool? Okay, you might be thinking, why were you talking about hammers so much? For some reason, tool theorists, they can think about hammers, chairs, and tables. Well, let's move on to something else. So let's put aside the hammer. Let's think about another tool. What we think about a digital tool like a phone? If I think about it neutrally, I might be thinking more along the lines of, how can I use it? So what good uses can I put it to? How can I abuse it and put it towards bad uses? How could I hurt other people through it? How could I help other people through it? And that can be a good way to think about tools. But we can also think about in a different way of, how was this made? How are other people maybe being exploited in the creation of this tool, generally, or this particular phone? I can think about what power structures are in place for who has access to this phone and who doesn't. I can think about different embodied ways of knowing that are going into making this phone, and not just think about just a limited view of knowing as cognition. And that's where data feminism come into play, and an aspect of that called feminist care ethics. And what we're going to be doing this week, and later on when you do your podcasting week, is examine different ways to explore the ethical ramifications of tools. Because everything you use in this class can be explored in that way. You can say it's a neutral tool. Let's think about something like Spiral that you just used. I can say it's a neutral tool, and it depends on the kind of content I put up there. Or I could say, is there something embedded in it? Are the values of digital humanities, of collaboration, equity, and experimentation embedded in it? I can also say, whose labor is being used to create that? And in the case of Spiral, it was the late Stephen Sinclair, Jeffrey Rockwell, and others who were involved in that project. But I can also think about it in a sense of, how does it allow me to provide care for others? And that's a big part of feminist ethics and data ethics, is this idea of care ethics. And so let's take a step back. We think about tool theory, but let's think about ethics in general. I want to make this clear so you can think about, what kind of ethical theories do you ascribe to? Because whether you've articulated them or not, or read about them or not, you probably are following one of the main big ones in your life. So let's go through that very quickly, and then we'll think about how care ethics is different than others. So let's start with the idea of, some things are right and some things are wrong. That's called deontology. It can be a rules-centered one, where you say something is just intrinsically wrong. Going back to tool theory, we can say that, well, of course you can think about it as neutral because it has to do with my actions. So if I'm going to use this to build shelter for someone else, that's intrinsically good. If I use this to murder someone, that's intrinsically evil. Deontology will operate in that way. Now I could say, well, what if I want to think about the consequences, the effects of it? So maybe I say that I want to minimize pain as much as possible in the world. And so I'm going to do the same action. I'm going to use that hammer to build a house for someone. And so I'm protecting them from the elements. I'm reducing suffering. And that could be the idea of consequentialism. It's not so much that there's something intrinsically good or evil in the act itself, but we look at what are the effects of it. And yet another one that goes differently from all those, thing called virtue ethics. That's the idea where I think about, who do I want to be? How do I want to act? What habits will I take up? What discipline will I put upon my life to make sure I can act that way when the chips are down and things get hard? Then those habits will be internalized, and that's how I'll act in a moment of stress. That's virtue ethics, where it thinks more about the holistic quality of life I want to have within a community. Related to that, but different, is feminist care ethics. Think about it this way. Feminist care ethics and virtue ethics are sort of like the high five that misses. They're both focused on human dignity and reverence for the other person, but they go about it a different way. So in feminist care ethics, I think about, how do I identify the needs of the other? And so I may think about still the hammer. Someone has no shelter, that's a need, because care is defined as meeting the need of the other. And that's a recent redefinition from Talia Schaefer's book. So care is meeting the need of the other. And so I might think about the way I'm using this tool, that I'm meeting the need of the other by building shelter for them. And the way care ethics goes into analyzing the situation is, it's not just a neat cut and dry of, I see the need and I meet it. It's more this reciprocal action where I maybe observe that someone has a need, and then I choose to meet that need. Then I carry out the caregiving by meeting that need. And then, but the other person will either respond to the need, the caregiving, will either respond to the caregiving or reject it, because these are two human persons in a relationship. And from early care ethics, there was a accusation of, that's focusing too much on one-way street, where maybe in an educational context, we talked about a lot as like, as the instructor, am I the caregiver? As a student, are you the care receiver? And that turns into not very healthy care relationships, when instead there's kind of a porous community in care relationships where people go in and out of being caregivers or care receivers. And that makes a healthier classroom environment as well. So what does this have to do with digital humanities? Well, in many ways, the things we're thinking about as far as feminist care ethics and feminist data ethics, those are embedded within digital humanities. So whatever way you come from, when I went to that list of different ways of viewing morality and ethics, use this week to sort of refine your way of doing ethical reasoning by using data feminism as a framework. If it's the one that you've heard what I was saying about care ethics, thought, yeah, that sounds great, then it might be what you have already internalized in how you treat others. If you were skeptical and thinking, no, I liked another one, I like consequentialism or deontology or virtue ethics, then great. That's a good thing to know about yourself, so you can engage in those with authenticity, because you'll be thinking about it directly as you purposefully make your ethical decisions. But by using a framework of another group to think through the implications of a technological situation that's very complicated, that can help sort of like oil your technological and ethical reasoning as you make your own decisions. So what you're going to do this week is you're going to apply data feminism to questions and case studies about generative artificial intelligence. And you're going to then provide solutions. So when you're doing this, don't just go with your knee-jerk reaction to it. Think about, how do you view morality? Then read the case study and say, how would this work within the sense of both feminist care ethics and feminist data ethics? Ask yourself, how is power operating here? How is anyone possibly being exploited? What labor is hidden? How are wider ways of knowing that I'm an embodied human person with emotions, how it's a good thing and that knowledge comes from that? How's that operating within this case study? And then provide a solution from that. Now, if you see it differently and want to provide a different solution or critique, you can do that. But engage the ethical reasoning of feminist data ethics first before offering critique, because it's very important to understand and to work with a new theory before responding to it. And throughout the term, we'll continue with this. It can be a way to think about how and why, or should I use this technology? Is it ethical to use this technology? And when we get to the podcasting unit, you're going to use Ivan Illich's ideas of tools for conviviality and Ellen Sakas's ideas of the 41 questions on technology to see a different angle on how to evaluate technology. And as you finish all of these, you can think about how can code work both in the infrastructure that we have from different tools or the code that we use, lead to care work and how we serve others and serve other communities. And you'll be returning to that as you propose your final projects and try to align them with your value statements from the beginning of the term.